Last year I did a video on the Soviet Guards formation during the Second World War. One question that came up was if these Guards units were elite or not, or in other words, if they were considerably more combat effective and or better equipped than regular units. First off, we must differentiate. Since most Guards units and formation had to earn their title, yet some like the Katyusha and breakthrough tank units had the title by default. Second, we also need to look at the various practices that were or should be different, like the handling of wounded, and finally, there's also the fact that the quality of the regular Red Army divisions changed over the course of the war. The first official Guards formation were the 4th Rifle Divisions that they were renamed into the 1st to 4th Guards Rifle Divisions in September of 1941. Yet the Guards title was not limited to divisions at all. In accordance with a practice begun in late 1941 and early 1942, when it awarded the honorific Guards to many divisions, corps, brigades and smaller units that distinguished themselves in combat. During the early stages of the Battle of Stalingrad in August 1942, the Stavka began awarding the same honorific title to armies, the first of which was the 1st Guards Army. By December 1942, it had also created the 2nd and 3rd Guards Army, both of which played key roles in the heavy fighting during the various stages of the Stalingrad counteroffensive. As you might know, the Soviets also had larger formations, which were called fronts, but I couldn't find any Guards front. For this I looked into Igor Nebolozin's index in his book on the tank battles in 1944-1945, David Glantz Titans Clashed index, and also Wikipedia Soviet front listings. Now let us look at the equipment question. For this we first look at Glantz. Unlike the designation Shock Army, the Guards title was awarded for distinction, and Guards armies tended to have stronger tables of organization, establishments than other armies and were often more effective. Similarly, Dick defines Guards the following way. Units and formations that distinguished themselves through the heroism and high combat effectiveness were granted the honorific Guards. Such organizations were strengthened with additional material of the latest types and more manpower, and the personnel were better paid. Now this is not necessarily wrong, but according to other sources is imprecise. First off, there was a clear distinction between the various arms. Some Guard units, like the infantry, had different table of organization and equipment, but for instance armor units did not. Additionally, although the table of organization and equipment for the infantry were different, this did not necessarily mean that they actually had more men and or material than non-Guard units at one time. As pointed out by Hill, Guards units and formations would subsequently receive better equipment and a greater number of supporting elements, even if their theoretically increased strengths would not always translate to manpower on the ground given their intensive use and heavy losses. This seems completely in line with what Sharp writes. Unfortunately, and especially in 1941 and early 1942, most of the units that became Guards did so by gutting themselves in battle. A Guards unit could distinguish itself initially, but after that its performance could fall off dramatically, until it either got reinforced with better weapons or had a chance to train its replacements to the level that the original troops had reached. Let us take a closer look at the data for equipment. First with the Guards Rifle Divisions. On the 10th December 1942, the People's Commissariat for Defense beefed up the artillery strength to its increasing number of Guards Rifle Divisions by adding a 3rd 76mm artillery battery to the division's 3rd Battalion, increasing the strength of the Guards Division's artillery strength to 268 guns and mortars, versus 250 of the regular Rifle Division according to Glantz, yet 252 according to Zaloga and Ness, including 36 76mm guns versus 32 of the regular Rifle Division, and 12 122mm howitzers, same as the regular Rifle Division. In terms of men, the December 1942 organization of the regular Rifle Division had, according to Glantz, Zaloga and official sources, a total of 9,435 men. Note that other sources, namely Sharp and Dunn, note 9,354 men here, which seems to be a mix-up of the numbers. This is in contrast to the Guards Rifle Division with 10,670 men, so about 30% more men. In terms of submachine guns, the difference was quite strong. Glantz notes 727 submachine guns for the regular division, whereas Sharp numbers for the Guards Rifle Divisions are 1,750 submachine guns. as such more than 140% more SMGs. There are also more light machine guns and anti-tank rifles, respectively 434 light machine guns versus 493 and 212 anti-tank rifles versus 294. As such, at least in terms of small arms fire, there was a considerable difference in terms of firepower. I must add here that these numbers are not accounting for the larger manpower. This was an oversight I became aware during editing. So I also did the numbers while accounting for a larger manpower. The result is quite interesting. In terms of submachine guns, the difference was still very significant with 113%. Yet with light machine guns, there was no difference at all. Whereas for anti-tank rifles, it was 23%. Yet it seems that in late war, there was a major change in terms of authorized equipment, at least in theory. In December 1944, the difference between the Glantz rifle division and its regular counterpart became massive. When the Decemberstadt, which is the third table of organization and equipment, for the Guards authorized each division to expand its divisional artillery into an artillery brigade with separate howitzer, mortar and light artillery regiments and its own Su-76 battalion. This organization was extended to all rifle divisions in June 1945 after the war was over in Europe, and there's evidence that very few divisions actually received any of this reinforcement before the war ended. The better equipment was also the case for the Guards air regiments, as pointed out by Hill. This designation often had real meaning, where for example in the case of the 8th Air Army involved in the Stalingrad blockade the previous year, 7 aces with more than 10 victories from the 9th Guards Fighter Air Regiment, along with 3 from the 296th Fighter Air Regiment and 2 from the 11th Air Fighter Regiment were subsequently concentrated in the 9th Guards Fighter Air Regiment that was re-equipped with Yak-1 aircraft instead of Lag-3s. Yet for Guards tanks formations, the situation is a bit different. The 1st Guards Tank Brigade was designated in November 1941, yet generally the Guards tank formations were far fewer in numbers and as such their impact was rather limited. Yet unlike the Guards rifle divisions, there was no difference in the table of organization and equipment between the Guards tank units and regular tank formations, with the exception of the heavy tank regiments, yet those had the Guards title by default and did not have to earn it, although Guards armored corps seem also have to be equipped earlier with better equipment. The only distinction was that in 1944 Guards corps tended to be re-equipped with T-34s/85s a little earlier than regular tank or mechanized corps. On the other hand, a number of regular corps had heavy assault guns or tank regiments earlier than the Guards counterparts. The distinction was based more on the anticipated mission of the corps than on its past history or title. As mentioned before, Guards formations could bleed out if they were used excessively. In order to increase cohesion and combat effectiveness, early on measures were taken. In December 1941, the People's Commissariat for Defense had specified that wounded Guards personnel with all but the most serious injuries were to be kept in medical facilities as close to the front line as possible in order to facilitate their return to the Guards unit to preserve the special nature of their cadres and to preserve the military traditions. Although how often this practice was or could be followed is hard to determine, Hill notes various examples. Feeding just any reinforcements into Guards unit could and did lead to a dilution of quality and esprit de corps. As one Major Zayunkovsky notes for the 38th and the 41st Guards Rifle Divisions near Stalingrad in late September 1942, and particularly when there wasn't time to integrate them into the unit before they were flown into combat. Similarly, such expedients may have contributed to the 62nd Army Commander Chuikov's suggestion in January 1943 that Guards divisions weren't really all that different from other divisions, highlighting desertions from the 13th Guards Rifle Division. That the practice was not consistently followed seems to be underlined by the fact that in February 1944 a General Staff document noted the problem that criminal elements and traitors to the motherland made it into Guards units by local recruiting. For air units, it seems that the practice of returning previously wounded and generally providing better recruits worked out better, which is likely especially considering the myriads of riflemen versus a few pilots and crew members. Now, the final point in terms of effectiveness is a relative one, for which one must also consider the changes within the Red Army throughout the war. Sharp makes this very interesting point. After the winter of 1942-1943, the formation of new Guards units above regimental level falls off dramatically. The reason is simple. By that time, the bulk of the Red Army units have reached the same level of competence. In 1943, with over 900,000 officers, sergeants and men in the military schools and training units, the Soviets could be fairly certain that the unit would operate the way it was supposed to, if not brilliantly, then at least consistently. Although this statement seems to be contradicted by Hill, in April 1943 the Stavka, High Command of the Armed Forces, issued an order that explicitly sought to preserve Guards corps and armies for offensive operations or counterattacks, otherwise pulling them back from the front line in order to train. At least in such circumstances, new recruits could be more effectively incorporated in such units, and their wounded personnel would be more likely to rejoin their unit. The question is if this was followed or if the losses were so extensive, if we consider the following aspect mentioned by Sharp. By 1944, in fact, the difference in performance between Guards and regular units was so small that many regular tank and mechanized corps received heavy reinforcements, like heavy tank regiments, before the Guards units did. And the selection of which rifle unit should make a critical assault depended on the individual unit than its title. Assuming that Sharp and Hill are correct, then either the April 1943 order was not followed and or the use of these formations in operations had gutted the Guards formations substantially, which might result in the 1944 situation there was little to no performance difference, which also might be a result of better training of the regular units as well. To summarize, most Guards formations were generally better equipped on paper by having slightly different tables of organization and equipment with extra men and material. In overall, it seems that Guards formations were likely to receive better equipment early as well. As such, generally these formations should have a better combat effectiveness if the man and equipment was assigned. One aspect that might have resulted in increased combat effectiveness was continuous employment and or at crucial points. This could lead to the units being bled out. This is related to the intended practices of replacing losses, which recovered wounded soldiers from the same formation, although the current information seems to be inconclusive how regularly this was followed or not. Another dimension is that the overall quality of the Red Army improved over time, as such a difference in early war between regular and Guards units were likely more pronounced than in late war. Furthermore, although by the end of 1941 only 10 rifle divisions had earned the title of Guards, by the end of the war there were more than 100 Guards rifle divisions alone. Generally, it seems that Guards formations and units were likely more combat effective due to one or more of the various factors, unless it had been bled dry. Yet looking at the large numbers and inconsistent statements, probably only a limited number can be considered elite. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Jens for helping out with further sources for determining the size of the rifle organization from December 1942. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, sources are listed in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.